Land Services, and she manages the Seed Services Unit there. Natasha coordinates the annual native seed harvest and direct seeding program, and she oversees the operation of the Murray Seed Bank. Jim is a Landscape Restoration Officer with Goulburn Broken CMA and has worked in the environmental management and revegetation industry for the past 20 years, and over this time one of his critical points of focus has been native seed supply. So if you'd like to welcome Natasha to the stage, she'll speak for the first 15 minutes and then we'll hear from Jim.
So hello everyone. So I work for Murray Local Land Services. So we're in the Murray LLS region today, and we're also doing a tour through to our seed bank on Thursday if anybody is really keen and hasn't signed up already for that. So a little bit about my background. I started my working career as a land care coordinator, so spent 10 years as a land care coordinator based in Corowa. And during that time, I had a lot of wonderful mentors that kind of introduced me to native plants and seed collection and seed services and the things that we do. Over the summer, we're out harvesting. We clean and process all of the seed ourselves. We have our temperature and humidity controlled seed vault at Deniliquin, where we store the seed. We also have, so we have two staff, myself part-time and Matt, who's out there part-time. And then we have a team of 8 casual staff that we use for our seed harvest and also for our direct seeding. So our casual staff do our direct seeding as well. So we collect the seed, we clean it, we store it, we treat it, and we put it back out in the landscape. We don't grow tube stock, so we do sell seed to nurseries, and they'll grow tube stock up for us and for their own purposes. But we concentrate on being able to get things out in that broad-scale landscape kind of way using direct seeding. We provide lots of revegetation advice, so we go out and talk to landholders or community groups or local government or whoever is interested in doing revegetation and give them advice on how to set up sites, what species might be suitable for their area, you know, site management, site preparation, all that kind of stuff. And we also have a network of seed production areas, and I found Andy's talk really interesting. We battle with all of the same challenges. I'll talk a little bit more detail, but mostly I'm going to hand that to Jim, the whole seed production discussion. But we have a network of seed production areas that we maintain. We're involved in other projects. For example, I'm involved in we have an endangered orchid project that I'm involved in that we'll talk about on the tour on Thursday. And we have a lot of partners and organisations that we work with in that seed services revegetation type of space. So predominantly, it's not my friend. So predominantly, in brief, we do seed collection. We concentrate our seed collection on core species that we use in our direct seeding. We would like to collect a wider range of rarer, more difficult to collect species, but predominantly we don't have the resources, in short, to do that. So we really do concentrate on those species that we can collect in bulk and that we can use in revegetation, and we have some seed cleaning equipment. But all of the seed that we collect across the catchment. We also go into Riverina LLS and collect in there. We do jump across into Victoria every now and then and get some collections from Victoria, but predominantly we service the Murray region, which is becoming interesting because we're getting a lot of inquiries from much further afield in the last couple of years, particularly with carbon farming and things like that, and people wanting to do large-scale revegetation. But for the most part, we can't service it because you know, they can be 300 and 400 kilometres away, and we just don't have the species and the provenance that they're after, although some of them are not too concerned with provenance. We do predominantly collect things that we collect prominently eucalypts and acacias and shrubs and things like that. We do collect some native grasses. We do have a native grass seed harvester, which is a little picture there. So it's like a push mower that has little brushes on the front and grabs grass seed. We haven't used that a lot, but potentially we can. So we do get inquiries for native grasses, but because of the time and the effort that goes into collecting it, we just don't have the resources to be able to do a lot of collection as far as native grasses go. And that's just some examples of some of the seed racks and seed that we've had drying. So anything that comes in, we lay out on racks for, you know, depending on how long it takes to dry, but normally a week to 2 weeks before we process that seed. And then it goes into our seed vault. And people get really impressed. You guys know what a seed vault is, but if I tell people that we have a seed vault, a lot of people go, oh my God, a seed vault. And then I show them the picture and go, it's actually, you know, a refrigeration unit that you might see, you know, at a pub or something, and it's temperature and humidity controlled, and it's just full of shelves and bags of seed. So it sounds really impressive, but physically when you look at it, it's not that impressive. But yeah, so we've had that facility. It's been relocated a couple of times, so it was at Berrigan and now it's at Deniliquin. It has the capacity to store about 3.5 tonne of native seed, and currently we have, I think it's just over 1,600 kilos of seed stored in there at the moment. So one of the important factors, I guess, in that whole seed collection storage thing is our record keeping. So we do manual seed collection sheets for every single seed lot that we collect. And I can talk to you at any time about what we have on there. And then we have a custom-built access database where we input all of that data. So every single bit of seed that we collect will be given a collection number, and that collection number travels through that the lifespan of that seed for us. So it's always on the bag of the seed, and then we have records that know, so we know exactly what collection or what seed lot's gone out into the ground, what's gone to nurseries, all that kind of stuff. So we have quite a good record-keeping system. Which is great. And that's just an example of basically everything that's on our seed collection sheet manually that we fill out in the field then is transferred into the database manually when we deposit the cleaned seed into the vault. So that's just an example of some of the data that we collect out in the field for our seed lots. And again, if anybody wants to talk to me more about that later, feel free. So seed production areas, one of the big things that we manage is a whole network of seed production areas. So traditionally, back in the 1990s, early 2000s, we had a whole lot more than what we do now. So we had about 75 to 80 seed production areas on our list, right across the Murray and into the Riverina LLS. All of them predominantly were on private land and involved private landholders. They ranged in size from really quite small sites with 1 or 2 species in them up to quite large ones with, you know, might have 20 species. Over time, a lot of those were set up in the 1990s, and we didn't reinvest in them after they were established. So over time, they have actually fallen out of production, and a lot of those now are simply biodiversity sites that landholders have, and we don't go back and collect from them because the plants age, they die, they get disease, all that kind of stuff, and they become unviable for us to use as seed production areas. Some we have reinvested in, and we've done pruning, we've done pulled out dead plants, we've replanted and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, most of those original sites that we had, we don't use anymore. So currently we have 17 active seed production areas, and I did mean to do a map and then I forgot about it. But they're spread right across. The Murray catchment is a long, skinny catchment, and they're spread, you know, right across the catchment basically. Most of those are still on private property, but the new seed production areas that we have established in the last 5 years have been on travelling stock reserves. So LLS manage travelling stock reserves, so we're establishing them on public land that we manage, which makes it a lot easier for us in that we have complete control over what's going on. And also with our seed production areas, we pay landholders for the seed that we collect. We only have one landholder that actually collects their own seed. Predominantly, they're just happy to have the plants on their place. They're happy for us to come in, our casual staff come in each summer and collect what's there. And then we pay them for the seed, which is uncleaned, and we have a payment rate that we pay for seed. The bonus of moving our seed production areas onto the travelling stock reserves is that we don't have to pay anybody for the seed, so it's a cost saving for us. And we can have quite large sites. So we've got one that's 10 hectares, which is, has just this season just gone, was our first year that we collected some seed off that, so that's all pretty exciting. And we have all of those issues with provenance and how many collections we get into a spa, the diversity that we're trying to go for. So we try and do plants or collections, remnant collections, as many plants as we can get from 4 to 6 sites, more if we can, and then we get those plants grown out, and they're what go into our seed production area. We would love to do more in that space, but it's a little bit resource poor. But yeah, we certainly is going to be a big focus for us, continuing to be a big focus for us going forward. So just a little bit about our direct seeding program. So as I said, we've got 5 direct seeding machines. 3 of them are currently operational. 2 of them are a bit old and are sitting there waiting for maintenance. But we go out and so we'll have an order come in. It'll be predominantly our customers, our government agencies, our own internal LLS funded projects, private landholders, national parks, local government, community groups, all that. So we have a range of clients that we service, and 95% of the seed that we collect and store goes back into the ground as direct seeding. So only 5% of the seed that we have goes to nurseries, or we sell to nurseries. So it's very much a direct seeding focused business. And so, yeah, I don't know if anybody's familiar with direct seeding, but the seed goes in the top of the yellow boxes on the direct seeding machines. It's calibrated to go out at a certain rate. It creates a little furrow and the seed gets dropped out on the ground. So not every species can be direct seeded. Some species are not conducive to direct seeding, and they're the ones that we encourage people to plant as tube stock. And we can have, so that's just an example of some direct seeding that's come up. And some of the research that I would love to see is why it does and doesn't work. Sometimes we can't explain why it does and doesn't work. Sometimes we have amazing success, and other times sites just fail and we honestly have no idea why. The seed mix might be the same, the soil type is the same, the seasonal conditions are the same, but one site will work and one site won't. So it's a little bit of a mystery. So I'm getting the hurry up, so I'm just going to go really quickly now. So some of our challenges, so this table just shows some of the figures from our seed harvest over a few different years. We have seen a gradual decline in the amount of seed available for collection. Some of that is because some of our seed production areas, well, a lot of our seed production areas kind of came out of production, but also climate change and also impacts to remnants. So a lot of our alternate collection, our remnant collections are on roadsides and they're subject to a whole lot of pressures. So it's not uncommon for us to find a valuable seed collection site bulldozed out one year and things like that. The thing is, over time, some of those sites are coming back. So whereas we've lost a lot out of the system, some of those young plants that have regenerated in those sites are now actually old enough to produce seed. So they're coming back into the system for us, which is a nice thing. But back in our heyday, 2010-2011 collection season, we collected nearly 1 tonne of native seed, and that's after it's been cleaned and deposited into the bank. Whereas the last few years, we're looking at, 250 kind of kilos worth of seed. Some of our current challenges, some of these things have already been mentioned by speakers already over the conference so far. But yeah, that declining amount of seed to be able to collect it and be viable in a changing climate. Managing our seed production areas is always a big thing. Even because we operate within a state government organisation, we have limitations on what we can do as far as our business model goes. We're a fee-for-service organisation, so we charge people for the direct seeding that we do, but we can't carry profits through to the next financial year. So that's a bit of an issue when, your organisation wants to see you at least make a, break even, and then it's with those fluctuating financial years and the availability of work, we can't carry profits through to next year, but then, the next year we might make a loss and we can't buffer ourselves. So that's quite a challenge operating within a government system. And one more, so staff is a big thing too, maintaining staff, keeping staff. All of our casual staff, almost all of our casual staff are retired people who just enjoy going out and collecting seed in the summer, so that's an issue for us. And just a few interesting facts to finish before Jim has his talk. So an average of just under 250 kilos of seed we've collected over the past 3 years. We've been selling about 120 kilos of seed, but that varies up and down dramatically depending on what we've got going on. And we did, this season, we've got 568 kilometres worth of direct seeding booked in, over 238 hectares. Last year with COVID and things got shut down and we weren't allowed to move between regions and we weren't allowed to do this and we weren't allowed to do that, we only got, I think, 150 kilometres in, so it's highly variable. And back in the heyday where we had lots of money from the sale of Telstra, we had 4 full-time staff and 35 casual staff in seed services. So we're, it's been a shifting environment for us in seed services. So thank you, that's it.
Thanks, Tash. Okay, I work with Gombrocke CMA, and I'm here to talk about Gombrocke Seedbank in partnership with quite a number of groups. So we've got the Euroa Arboretum, Landcare, there's also contractors. Andy Guerin from Regent Honeyeater is very much in our seed production world, and any taxonomic questions go straight to him, obviously, so don't ask me that one. And really about this talk is about scaling up, and if we look at the Golden Broken catchment, and this is the map of the ecological vegetation classes from yesteryear. So you can see how the diversity of those vegetation classes show how the diversity of species within those vegetation classes would have been in those days, from grasslands to granitic hills to sand hills, and the riverine plains. So if we have a look, that's really what we're dealing with in our catchment. And this is Yorta Yorta country and Tungarung country. So we are very keen to partner with Yorta Yorta and Tungarung, and they have been working with us for many years now in understanding their culture, understanding the needs of vegetation in the landscape, and working with young blokes who are coming through and young women who are taking on ranger roles as well. And there's a whole future there for traditional owners to take on a lot of our work, because the work we actually do is it's all cultural species that we're working with. The species that we deal with, I was talking to Amos yesterday about this, is that imagine if you wake up every morning and you've got to make your living out of the landscape every single day. And so that was just one of those things of understanding everything that's going on in an ecosystem to be able to survive. So what are the drivers for seed? And First Nations people, healing country and ecosystems is one of the major drivers. Restoring medicinal plants, food plants, weaving materials and stories that go with it. If you're out in the field and you're working, there's always a story at the end of the day, isn't there? There's always something that's happened. You've either nearly stepped on a snake, you've hurt yourself, or you've had a great load of seed for the day and it's been a really success and you walk away feeling happy. So there's country plans that the traditional owners have as well, and we look at a regional catchment strategy that we have and Victorian strategies, biodiversity strategies, all these. But I think the country plans are what we need to be aiming for in the future. We have climate change policies, obviously. There's issues across the globe. Climate change, we've got carbon offset industries, we've got corporate agricultural investors with green ethical obligations and ideas. There's threatened species out there, threatened ecosystems and strategies to work on that. Biodiversity loss and strategies. And there's agriculture industry. They need ecosystem services to survive. For healthy land, increased food production, pollination services for crops, clean water, temperature regulation, shade shelter for livestock, soil retention, erosion, salinity mitigation, human health, clean food, water, oxygen, soils. It's all the necessities of life for us all. So that demand for native vegetation is really high, and a lot of responsibility on seed and seed banks to deliver that, which is, when you've been in the industry for 20 years and things haven't changed much, you sort of start to think you've failed. And Martin, I was talking to you about that the other day. I think, you just think, when is that change going to happen when we actually scale up? And is it going to happen? So the Victorian Biodiversity 2037 plan says 200,000 hectares by 2037 of revegetation, and that would be a combination, I'm guessing, of direct seeding and supplementary planting, because we can't plant everything. We haven't got the labour force, so we need direct seeding to work. That means 120 tonnes of seed across Victoria, and let's guess there's 10 million nursery plants that go with it as supplementary plants. Not everything direct seeds. That's 96 million in seed in Victoria and $30 million in nursery plants. And I don't see that coming through in our funding. And that's just the raw seed material. What about the coordination and contractors and all that delivery and those landholders who put in their time? Scaling up again, I'll just go to another example, the Golden Broken catchment. We've got 1.2 million hectares of private land. If we were to revegetate 10% of that land, once again, direct seeding and supplementary planting, there's 76 tonnes of seed needed. And currently the Golden Broken Seed Bank and Regent Honeyeater project collects an average of 160 kilograms per year, 700 kilograms in cool storage, and uses about 80 kilograms per year. And this is largely volunteers and part-time and casuals, and it's just not a sustainable future if we have to deliver all these numbers. Go back. So we need massive investment, obviously. And what sort of quality are we delivering in the end? So the responsibility of the seed banks is to have seed quality, quantity of kilograms, species diversity and availability of those species across multiple ecosystems, and genetic diversity, and can you get the taxonomic right as well while you're at it? So here's the two options that we've got and that we work on in the Golden catchment is lots of diversity, lots of populations of the species that we're working with, and this is a photo of Andy Guerin's Nursery at Region Honeyeater project. Lots of species, lots of populations. Or you can just go and do this really cheaply. You can go grab one jar of seed and make 1 million plants out of it if you wish. Just one population. And that's what you're going to get. You're either going to get that clonal type of scenario which has no persistence into the future, or you've got a diversity of populations, adaptation potential, and I guess possibility of a future climate species as such. I just want to go through some of the seed production because we have been working on seed production for a while, and across many different veg types and different systems. So there's been some ground layer catching type of mechanisms. The raised box beds at Euroa Arboretum have been pretty successful with grassland species. And then there's just standard shrub layer species planted as a normal project. We also have areas that might be 100 hectares of a seed production area, but you might only have 300 trees in there, like the drooping she oaks there. Silver Banksia has been another great story. I'll talk about that later if we've got time. This is a schematic of how it works. We go out, we collect from as many populations as we can and as healthy as we can, as many parent plants as we can. We take that seed on those packets and they go to the nursery and they propagate those plants out. It goes into a seed production site that's been prepared. We harvest that seed when it's mature. It goes into the ground, into new projects, and then you have that new population, which is a representation of all those other populations. And I guess when you go back to that original slide of the genetic transfer through all that system, those ecosystems, this is trying to catch up. It's trying to improve the systems that we've got. A great example is glycine tabachina at Euro Arboretum, where this system has worked really well. And whereas in going out in the field and collecting from the wild, you may have come home with maybe 100 grams if you're lucky. And now we have access to many kilograms of seed to put this species back into our projects. Seed collection and processing takes, you can't get away from the labour component in this. It's just a lot of labour getting out in the field and collecting. And Janet Hagan over here, she collected 35 kilograms just with her family herself. So that's how dedicated some of the people are that we work with. This is the Euroa seed bank, just some more processing. I was told about this. A lot of planning goes on. So there's a lot of seed populations that are bagged up and ready to go and worked out which ones are we going to prioritise, which species are we going to prioritise. And of course, there's a lot of work in the background to do with herbivore-proof fencing and growing them out, obviously, and then putting it in the ground. Finding the right site, getting the right landholder on board. Public land probably has been pretty good and successful in the past. And I just want to go through this, is the Euro Arboretum Seed Bank are going through a bit of a discussion at the moment about regional seed banks and scaling up, and this is what they have been talking about. So Golden Seed Bank is currently harvesting roughly half the seed currently required for current annual revegetation demand. Wild seed harvest is time consuming and problematic. Not every season is favourable for seed collection, Frequently there is poor seed set with dry conditions or with early heat, seed aborts or ripens very quickly when we miss collection. Seed harvest occurs over a wide area with extensive travel time. Indigenous seed and plant production is highly labour intensive. Many of the growers are now in their 60s or even 70s. Growing plants and seed selection requires skill, in-depth plant knowledge and is physically demanding. We drastically need to train new committed staff to meet the future demand. The bulk of the work in both nurseries and seed banks is undertaken by part-time staff and volunteers. The seasonal nature of the industry means it is difficult to offer continuity of employment, reasonable pay and long-term career paths. Much reliance is therefore placed on individuals who are committed to the need for Indigenous revegetation rather than seeking the reward that their efforts deserve. The commercial realities of Indigenous plant production and seed bank management are extremely poor. Although demand for Indigenous plants is potentially high, the lack of investment in people, infrastructure and most importantly land means prices of seed and plants are insufficient. Consequently, it is difficult to build long-term sustainable businesses. So the future for seed production investment to meet the demand of seed is the seed production sites initially require at least 10 hectare site in the short term and more like a 50 hectare site in the longer term. Ideally public land for ease of access, we need to manage weeds, predator-proof fencing, potential at some sites for irrigation to ensure viable seed collection during dry years, costing $1.5 million in our particular case as an initial setup and $600,000 per year ongoing for staff. This is just one seed bank in Victoria. Multiply this by maybe 4 or more, and then across Australia as well. And we have to compete for funds all the time, so we're competing against the rest of Australia. And this is the difficult part because everyone's priority is a priority for themselves in their own country. I've only got a few minutes time. 1 minute? Is that it? So I'll finish on this slide actually. So signs of scaling up. We had Kilter Rural come in and say to us, we're going to buy up some land, and they ended up buying, they're an agricultural organisation, and they bought up 1,600 hectares of agricultural land. And we had a chat to them. They said, we want to do some fencing and so forth. And we said, no, you've got 1,600 hectares. Let's do some serious paddock revegetation. So they just came on board. It was really good because we ended up having a large 290 hectares total out of their 1,600 hectares has gone to revegetation. And we were able to have those connections through the landscape at a much larger scale that we were ever used to. So that's probably it for me because I know I've overdone it. I could go to Banksias and we could talk Banksias forever, but that's all right. Thanks, you, Margaret. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jim and Natasha. I've got seed envy. Kilograms of seeds, that's the dream. All right, our next two speakers will be online, and we have Lucy Commander, first of all, who will be talking about the Florabank Guidelines and the seed supply chain. And then we'll have a talk from Ben Croxford from Nuts About Natives about propagating recalcitrant and threatened species for rehabilitation. Lucy is a restoration seed ecologist with a background in arid zone seeds and mining restoration, and she recently led the update of the Florabank Guidelines. Ben has over 20 years of experience as the owner and manager of Nuts About Natives, and he specialises in growing plants for restoration, focusing on increasing biodiversity. Okay. Would you welcome, first of all, Lucy Commander.
Hi everyone, I'd like to tell you about the new edition of the Florabank Guidelines, the best practice guidelines for native seed collection and use. Today I'm going to talk about when we need seeds, what we need to know and why we need guidelines, as well as the revision process for this new edition and the content of what's in these guidelines. My key message today is that everyone associated with native seeds, from policy right through to planting, should read the Florabank Guidelines. So when do we need seeds for restoration? Well, in some instances, seed is in fact not required because different approaches are needed for restoration for different species and in different places. Sometimes removing threats to enable natural regeneration, such as fencing, may be sufficient if the area has enough seeds in the seed bank or plants can respawn. However, if the land is cleared or highly degraded, seed inputs may be required to replace missing species or increase numbers. We recognise the importance of ex situ conservation, such as seed banking and nursery propagation, to support in situ conservation activities such as seeding and planting. But when we've made the decision to use seeds in restoration, there are so many questions. Which species to use, where from, how much, how do we store these seeds, what's their quality? So best practice guidelines can help us answer these questions. The first edition of the Florabank Guidelines was published in 1999 and 2000, and they were originally a set of 10 guidelines. This second edition is part of the APCC Healthy Seeds project funded by the New South Wales Government through its Environmental Trust. We've expanded it to 15 modules and it was released in August 2021, and you can now download it for free from the Florabank website. Everyone involved in restorative activities should read the guidelines, especially those involved in the seed supply chain. This is the seed supply chain in this graphic here, and it starts with selecting species and collection locations, moving through to collection, possibly seed production areas, then processing, testing, drying and storage, and then either nursery propagation to planting or direct seeding, finishing up with monitoring, reporting and adaptive management. Other people in decision-making roles such as policy and funding should also read the guidelines. The reasons why these people should read the guidelines is because they're an opportunity for knowledge sharing and collaboration between different parts of the sector, and also so that knowledge can reach policy makers as well as end users, and finally to help improve seed literacy across the sector and to lift standards. So please distribute the guidelines to your collaborators, seed collectors, suppliers and end users. For the update process, we firstly formed a reference group. We listed the modules, and some of these we merged and others split, and we created some new modules as well. We invited authors who drafted each module. This was then peer reviewed. We addressed the reviews, proofread, and then went into production before web publication. It's available on the web to read online, but it's also available for download, and people can print out if they want or just save the PDF to read on their computer. So what's new in this new edition? Well, we've got a lot of new photos illustrating different techniques. We've got some conceptual diagrams and decision trees as well. Now I'll go through the content of each of the 15 modules, starting with the introduction. This module talks about the Australian native seed industry as well as species selection for seed-based restoration. It goes through the content and the structure of the 15 modules, which basically follow the seed supply chain from sourcing right through to nursery propagation and planting as well as direct seeding. It also has some supporting modules which support each aspect of the supply chain. So these are working with Indigenous Australians, approvals, principles and standards, record keeping and buying and selling seeds. In the second module, we talk about working with Indigenous Australians and provide some information on their seed knowledge, partnerships, permission and engagement. The third module is about approvals, principles and standards for seed collection, and we talk about licensing and legislation, guiding principles as well as standards and accreditation. The fourth module is all about record keeping, and we go through record keeping concepts, how to design electronic record keeping, what to record, and different types of technology that you can use, such as smartphones and apps, as well as spreadsheets and databases. The seed sourcing module provides information to help decide where to collect seeds, whether close to the restoration site or from a more distant location, and includes a decision tree to help select a sourcing strategy. It's important to keep records on the collection location so that a seed sourcing decision can be made. The key message for this module is that capturing greater genetic diversity in seed collections by sourcing from seed from as many well-spaced plants across a population as is practicable. The seed collection module provides information on planning a collection trip, safety, understanding when to collect and also how much to collect, as well as information on methods and equipment. Seed production areas are an option if you don't need seed quickly, you can't collect or purchase sufficient seed, and you need large quantities of seed. There's a lot of decision making surrounding seed production, such as where to source founding material, what types of abiotic and biotic environments they might need, and all different types of growing systems. So there's lots of information in this module to help with this. Seed processing really talks about this post-harvest drying, seed extraction, and also seed cleaning, and gives different options for different scales. The seed drying and storage module explains about how collecting mature seeds, processing these as soon as possible, and storing cool and dry can maximise seed longevity. It also outlines the different storage options for different storage lengths of time or different purposes, whether that's short, medium, or long-term storage. The seed quality testing module talks about the importance of seed quality testing because if it isn't, non-viable seeds could be used in restoration. Purchasers could pay too much for seeds they think are viable but in actual fact aren't. And without knowing the seed quality, it's very difficult to calculate sowing rates. The types of testing that might be required could depend on the species and the storage history as well as the end use. And this little graphic here basically steps you through to show the different types of tests there are and the different types of information that you can get out. So firstly, if you look at a seed purity assessment, you're really having a look at the proportion of seed to non-seed material. The seed fill test will just tell you how many seeds contain an embryo. The viability will tell you which proportion of those are alive, and then the germination test will tell you the proportion of seeds that are able to germinate at that point in time. Understanding requirements for seed germination can improve restoration success. This module provides information on designing germination tests. If seeds don't germinate, they may be dormant, and determining the dormancy class as well as knowing the seed's natural environment provide clues for conditions or pre-treatments that overcome dormancy. Seed enhancement technologies are post-harvest treatments to improve seed delivery, germination, or plant performance. These can either physically alter or physiologically manipulate the seeds. Some examples include seed coating, priming, pelleting, acid digestion, and flash flaming. The nursery propagation and planting module talks about the differences between when you may choose to use tube stock versus direct seeding. It discusses options for growing containers as well as media, non-seed propagation methods as well as hygiene, propagation timing and site preparation. The direct seeding module discusses approaches, site assessment and preparation and machinery, as well as providing assistance on seeding rate calculations and monitoring. The final module talks about buying and selling seeds with top tips for seed purchases and calculating value for money using testing data. As I said, the Florabank Guidelines are a free download from the Florabank website. You can either read them online or, as circled here, you can download the PDF and print it out yourself. The Florabank Guidelines complements other ANPC-led publications such as the Plant Germplasm Conservation in Australia, the Translocation Guidelines, the Australian Native Seed Survey Report, and several of the Project Phoenix reports. I would like to acknowledge the funding from the New South Wales Environmental Trust, all the Florabank authors for volunteering their time, and in particular the ANPC staff and committee. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ben Croxford and my partner Anushka Cousin and I own and operate Nuts About Natives Nursery. Today I'd like to discuss some of the work we do in our nursery regarding the contract propagation of rare or recalcitrant plants for use in rehabilitating disturbed landscapes. We have a background in horticultural science and plant breeding and set up our nursery as a contract-based business supplying difficult to source native plants. Over time, a greater awareness of the value of using provenance-correct plants and a greater requirement to increase the biodiversity within revegetation projects created an opportunity for us to collect and grow provenance-correct plants for specific revegetation projects. The application of good quality topsoil where available and direct seeding is of course the main technique used in revegetation. However, the southwest is extremely biodiverse and many species will either not return or return in numbers significantly lower than those occurring at undisturbed reference sites. These are the plants we refer to as being recalcitrant in revegetation. This picture shows Netrostylus capillaris in our nursery. This species is a slow-growing, long-lived common species in the Jarrah forest, but is largely absent at rehabilitated sites, and as such is considered recalcitrant. As well as being highly biodiverse, the southwest also contains many rare species, and we have been involved with the propagation of many of these, as direct seeding is often not the best method to restore these species. This slide shows two such species in our nursery, Darwinia masonii and Macatheri curii. Seed propagation is always the first method considered when propagating rare or recalcitrant plants, as this maximises genetic diversity and, if successful, should be the most efficient method. We have an on-site seed laboratory where we can experiment with various seed treatments to determine optimal methods of germination under highly controlled conditions. Given the right treatments, some species previously considered difficult can be raised successfully. If seed propagation is unsuccessful or too expensive, methods of vegetative propagation, such as cuttings, divisions, and tissue culture, are examined. For certain species, cutting propagation can be a reliable method to produce high-quality tube stock. In this slide, I've used the example of Darwinia masonii, a rare ironstone species. Cuttings were taken from all the plants to be impacted by mining operations. Cuttings from each individual had to be collected, labelled, and be identifiable through the entire propagation process. These photos show just a small part of the overall job, but you can see from the different labels and get a feel for just how much work is involved with rare plants. The labelling is important to ensure as much genetic diversity is captured and could be measured. Maintaining genetic identity adds greatly to the expense and is only undertaken with rare plants. With recalcitrant plants, cuttings are bulked together, but special care is taken to collect from as many individuals as possible and from as many areas within the provenance zone as possible to maximise the genetic diversity. This slide shows another example of a rare ironstone species impacted by mining and successfully propagated in our nursery by cuttings. When propagating cuttings, we like to use cell trays, with each cutting getting its own cell, as this minimises the risk of damaging roots at the time of transfer and optimises the root morphology, as air pruning of the root tips produces a highly branched root system and reduces the risk of root binding or otherwise deformed root systems. There are many recalcitrant species which we reliably produce from wild collected cuttings. However, wild collected material can be of poor quality. Once successfully propagated and grown in the nursery, however, these plants offer very high quality material for further propagation, which can be used to supplement the wild collections. Some monocots can be successfully divided in the nursery to maximise the use of salvaged, difficult to germinate or tissue cultured species. We have successfully utilised this method with salvaging rare Lepidosperma gibsonii, as you can see in the top of this picture, and routinely use it to increase the number of tissue-cultured dryland sedges and rushes, or seed-grown monocots, such as Lepidosperma persicans in this bottom picture, where seedlings are difficult to produce. For some species, especially many from the Cyperaceae and Restianaceae family, cuttings are not appropriate, and seed, which is then progressively reduced over time. When tissue culture works, it can work really well, and this is just some of the approximately 40,000 tissue cultured plants, most of which are dryland sedges and rushes that we grow each year. The plants in this photo are mainly Lepidosperma and Netrostylus. However, very significant challenges still exist when doing this as a commercial venture. This is an expensive way to produce plants, and there is a significant lag between initiating plants, multiplying to sufficient quantities, and the eventual supply of tube stock. Also, it's difficult to manage the large number of genotypes required to ensure as much genetic diversity as possible is maintained. Finally, there is a massive risk associated with tissue culture, with significant losses possible at any time. However, when successful, tissue culture allows for the reliable production of significant numbers of juvenile, vigorous plants to a schedule that is not controlled by external environmental factors. The juvenility and vigour of these plants often enables further multiplication after deflasking, which for some species can be very significant. Here are some examples of the sorts of plants we are growing using tissue culture. This one is Hyperlenia excelsa, a Restianaceae species. This one is Mesmelenia pseudostygia, a common Cyperaceae species, but one that is difficult to propagate by other methods. We have many species of Lepidosperma locally, and we grow several, and they make up a significant part of the total number of recalcitrant plants we supply each year. There are many species of Lomandra locally, however they are rarely used in rehabilitation. We have grown several using tissue culture, with this species, Lomandra micranthus, being very successful. This one is Netrostylus. This one is Dasyphogan. Dicots, like this Scaevola here, or Grevillea, often grow really well in tissue culture and tend to have a much higher multiplication rate than the monocots. And finally, we've also had some early success with growing geophytes, which have traditionally proved difficult to produce in one season using standard nursery techniques, such as this Chamacilla. Thank you.
Thank you to Lucy and Ben. Our next speaker is Professor Nick Williams from the University of Melbourne, and Nicholas is talking about urban landscape plantings and the benefits to biodiversity.
Thank you. Thank you everyone, and thanks to the organisers for allowing me to move sessions, and I'd like to acknowledge that we do most of our work on Wurundjeri country. So urban horticulture is often viewed as a threat to biodiversity. We have lots of weeds coming in through urban horticulture, but I'd like people to think of it more as an opportunity. Landscape plantings, I'd argue, are an unrealised opportunity for ex situ plant conservation and seed production. I guess the key messages from this I've thrown up front because it's only a 10-minute talk, and that is that cities and local government areas have the resources, space and people to sustain significant restoration projects, and that they are increasingly interested in addressing the extinction crisis. Think about the number of local governments that have passed resolutions or passed policies around addressing biodiversity issues. And I know in Melbourne that a multitude of local governments have done this. So I think our challenge is to sort of, if they've done that, well, let's think about how you actually address that. What are the projects that local governments in urban areas can come up with for addressing ex situ conservation issues? And so urbanisation creates novel habitats. They can be weedy landscapes or disturbed areas, but they're also a whole bunch of horticultural plantings and different types of systems where we can do revegetation or much more managed plantings where we can think about using as ex situ conservation side of things. For the revegetation side of things, I'm not looking at that, but we can start to think about reintroducing rare species to some of those plantings, but also want to look at using the horticultural expertise potentially available in these local governments to be able to do this. The sad fact of the matter is that most local governments' mowing budgets are much bigger than your restoration budgets in terms of them mowing, their parklands and things like that. So can we take a little bit of that money and move that into plant conservation projects? And I'd argue that many local governments are receptive to that argument. And it's up to us to be creative about how we think about doing that. There's resources available in these urban areas which are not available in other places, which enable us to do that. There's irrigation, and a lot of these plantings are irrigated, meaning you get better survival and better seed production out of these systems potentially. the substrates that we use in horticulture, everyone brings in topsoil, but we can start to think a bit more creatively about that and have designed substrates where are specific to plant communities or individual species. And we've used that with scoria, we're using that for sand, and now we're playing with low nutrient subsoils, which are otherwise going to go to landfill. And importantly, there's a whole lot of people living in urban areas, many of whom are interested and can be trained to monitor plantings and collect seed. And I guess sometimes I think this is a bit of a throwaway line, but it facilitates connection for nature, and it is in numerous local, state government and federal government policies around connecting to people to nature. So can we think about our projects which can actually do that where they are living? So everyday connection to nature. I'm going to give a couple of examples of this projects that we've done primarily with the City of Melbourne, but wanted to point out that this is quite common in lots of local government areas, particularly inner city ones where there's often the interest and the grassy woodland plants into it. And this has got a bit of a horticultural aspect to it, so they want it to be long flowering, but we're using species from endangered vegetation communities in this. We had to produce the seed ourselves. It wasn't commercially available. So City of Melbourne paid us to produce the seed. So there's opportunities there. They're generating, they've got a demand for seed, so we need people to be able to supply it. We shouldn't be supplying seed for this. So we created a spa at Burnley using the techniques that John Del Pratt and Paul Gibson-Roy have developed, and that's ongoing, and we're now using that for other projects as well. So Catherine set up 54 plots. We got 6 different treatments. We got the sort of underlying soil, which was sort of degraded mulch. This area was under eucalypts, which had been mulched for a long time. Either 10 mil or 80 mil of sand, plus or minus jute to stop the erosion. There's a fair bit of weeding that went on. Catherine can recall her nightmares to you about that. And then we've been monitoring the plant cover, richness, weed biomass, how long it's taking, etc. And that data was collected. This was set up during COVID. My lesson to all students out there is ignore university rules. And it's irrigated. There's an irrigation line there. It's not irrigated this summer, but for establishment it was. So we got good establishment because there's irrigation available. It was direct seeded by hand using a sand mix with seed mixes made up. That's what it looked like in 2020, so it's looking pretty successful. The City of Melbourne and the local residents love it. So we're generating interest in these techniques. It's more cost effective than using tube stock, a little bit novel in terms of different substrates that we're playing with, but we're getting good community support for this, and they're going to double the area, move it the rest down Gatehouse Street next year. Well, sowing's going to happen next month, actually. So, of the species that have been planted, so 25 of those 27 have gone in and have come up. The xerochrysum is pretty dominant. Looks great colourful, but there's lots of those other species there as well, which are starting to increase and come through. All the herbs were produced from the spa we ran at Burnley. The grass seed was commercially purchased. Wrong way. Got to go back. There. We've got some rare species in there, so Rudidotus, Cullen and Leucochrysum. So they're coming up. That's probably the first time Rudidotus has come up from seed in the City of Melbourne in close to 200 years. Other opportunities, water-sensitive urban design, it's everywhere. It's got to be increased in abundance. But there's a limited suite of species. You know, are we all bored of Lomandra and Vacinia yet in water-sensitive urban design? It's specified by engineers, okay? They're not very creative people. We've got a whole suite of seasonal wetland species which are much more attractive, will do much more for biodiversity. Let's think about how we can work with the engineers to get these species into water-sensitive urban design installations. You still have a lot of Lomandra, but let's get some more interesting things in there. One of the things that we've played with in really just case study is Xerochrysum palustre. So I have a master's student look at this in terms of Naomi Sana. It's a rare species, grows in swamps and herbaceous wetlands. only 35 populations in 2010, and it's one of the species that the Raising Rarity Project identified as potentially good for increased horticultural use, and have a look at that project. It's really fantastic. We planted some Raising Rarity propagated plants into a little rain garden at Burnley, so it's a little case study, but they've increased and they're rhizomatous, they're spreading, it's doing okay in there. That's just one case study, but let's think about moving that to a larger, more rain gardens, do some trials working with local governments around that. They'd be more than amenable to those sort of things. And the last example I wanted to talk about very briefly is the Streetscape Biodiversity Project. We developed a plant palette with the City of Melbourne, trialled it at 4 sites, and this is around the, primarily for bees, butterflies and birds, but these are native species which are not normally planted, and let's think of, and some of them are regionally rare. We can increase that component as well. So there's interest from local governments, and you're getting good interest from people where they are as well. However, there are challenges. You need to convince the landscape architects to think about plant species other than Lomandra and Dianella and those sort of proven species. So they're potentially untested and they need to be coaxed into some of those things. We need to think about applying these genetic diversity guidelines that we're talking about here to that, and that's not typically what we do in horticulture. So can we source from multiple places? Better record keeping is required, and we need to upskill that workforce. We've had maintenance contractors spray out native plants because they thought they were weeds. So we need to work with the local governments around that side of things as well, but they're very willing to do that. So thank you.
Thank you. That sounds like a really great initiative. Our next speaker is Leah Dann, who's a PhD student at the University of Melbourne, and she's going to talk to us about native plant restoration on Norfolk Island. And Leah has just published a lovely book on how to propagate plants from Norfolk Island. Welcome, Leah.
Hi, everyone. First, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and to thank you all for a wonderful conference so far. So I'm going to talk today about natural regeneration and active restoration on Norfolk Island, and then end with telling you a little bit about the propagation guide that I, along with Lydia Guja and some collaborators from Norfolk Island National Park, created. So, oh wow. So Norfolk Island is a subtropical volcanic island in the South Pacific between New Caledonia and New Zealand. So you can see it's very isolated and therefore has a lot of endemic species. And then it's also very small. So it's only about a little less than 35 square kilometers in area. And the native remnant vegetation is really confined to that area outlined in red to the north, and that's the national park. And then there are a few scattered bits of native forest around the island, but really less than 20% of the island is forested, only about 460 hectares. And so this has resulted in a lot of threatened species. There are 46 EPBC listed plant species on the island, and of those, 15 are critically endangered and 31 are endemic. So it's really important to conserve these species both for global biodiversity and for the island itself. So how did things get to become like this? Well, before 1788, the island was very pristine. There was subtropical rainforest with Norfolk pines covering pretty much the entire island. But then when the convict settlement was established in 1788, there was a lot of land clearing for timber exports and pasture and croplands. And then invasive plant species started invading the island, as well as invasive animals like rats. And this led to a very degraded ecosystem and fragmented forest. So in 1986, the Norfolk Island National Park was established, and with that came a lot of restoration and management efforts. So two of the worst invasive plant species on guava for this talk, because it's one of the most prevalent and problematic species on the island. It forms really dense thickets that depresses native plant recruitment. So I set up plots in unmanaged thickets, as you can see on the photo in the left, and then in paired areas right next to the unmanaged thickets that have been managed 30 years ago to the present, and then allowed to naturally regenerate. So I surveyed trees, shrubs, and ferns, and this is just my nested plot design. And today I'll talk a little bit about species richness, abundance, and size class data. So this figure here shows species richness, or number of species on the y-axis, and then the unmanaged thickets are dark gray, and the managed plots are light gray. And there is a significantly higher species richness in the managed plots compared to the unmanaged thickets. And this richness likely increases with time since management. And this next figure shows the number of individual plants in a subplot on the y-axis. And then once again, the dark gray is unmanaged thickets and the light gray is managed plots. And if you look to the right, the very right part of the figure, that shows total number of individuals in a subplot, and it's significantly higher for the managed plots than for the unmanaged plots. And then if you look to the far left of the figure, that shows the number of canopy individuals, and it's about the same in the managed and unmanaged plots, but then there are far more understory plants and seedlings in the managed plots compared to the guava thickets. But unfortunately, the very rare plants don't seem to be regenerating very well, even 30 years after management. So the more common species that are already in the canopy are regenerating naturally just fine, but the more rare species are going to require a bit more active planting in order to increase their range and population sizes. And this lack of recruitment could be due to environmental conditions like canopy or soil changes from the guava thickets, and also because the soil seed bank is depleted of these native species. So instead of just being able to establish, they have to be brought into the area. And unfortunately, Norfolk has lost its only large seed dispersing bird. So Hemiphaga novaezelandiae is a wood pigeon, and it's the only bird on the island that used to propagate or disperse large seeded plant species, and it's also the longest range. So most birds have a small territory on the island, but this one would have covered the entire island and been able to disperse much greater distances. So a paper by Campbell and Atkinson looked at New Zealand islands that had a very similar history to Norfolk, where they were very deforested and then allowed to naturally regenerate for about 200 years. And they found that native species that were rare, including species that are the same species or similarly related to Norfolk species, weren't regenerating. And then once their species of wood pigeon was reestablished on the islands, these species started coming back because these pigeons were dispersing things like Proteria, which is not very well dispersed on Norfolk, and it also wasn't well dispersed on New Zealand. And then also when rats were removed from the islands, these rare species recovered even quicker because rats predate on a lot of those large fruited and large seeded species. And these are some examples of predation on Norfolk Island, so it's also a problem there. And then on Norfolk, there's also a lot of feral chickens, which destroy seedlings and make it even harder for native plants to recruit. So repairing these networks, especially bringing back lost functional groups, and then managing rats and invasive weeds, and replanting these rare species in combination with naturally regenerating the more common ones will be really good moving forward to restore more of Norfolk Island's species. And this also requires a lot of community involvement because a lot of the land on Norfolk is privately owned. And luckily, people there are very passionate about restoring their native vegetation. It's important culturally, it's important economically, and they're very proud of their natural environment. So in order to help with these sort of projects, we created a guide to propagating some of Norfolk Island's plants and seeds, and this is propagation of plants. And then it also talks a bit about the climate and general information about seed collection and dormancy and storage, as well as propagation techniques, just to help gain confidence in propagating anything on the island. But then we also talk a bit about species-specific propagation advice. So this is just an example table showing collection times and also fruit and capsule color when ripe, so that people can have a better idea of when and where to collect these seeds from. And then we provide some species-specific information about dormancy and seed storage behavior, as well as time to emergence and maturity, and some information about suitable habitats to plant their native plants out in, and suitable moisture and light levels. This is a sample species page for Wickstromia australis. It's a critically endangered native tree on Norfolk Island. And it's a great resource for the community and for practitioners to start growing some of these really threatened species, as well as species that are really important for initially regenerating an area that's been completely cleared. And the handbook's been received really well in the community. People were really excited to get a book that talks about the island and the importance and uniqueness of the plant species there, as well as some advice on the propagation. So there was a bit of a book launch where the nursery run by Norfolk Island National Parks had grown a lot of...
Is Ian Cranwell, who is a consultant with over 30 years experience in natural resources and land management in senior positions in New South Wales Government. And Ian is going to talk to us today about the National Native Nursery Network.
Once he works out how to do this, which isn't that. Which one is it? I'll follow. Right, now I'll go back. Right, slow learner. Thanks for having me. KG2 is an agricultural research company which largely specialises in doing phone surveys. We do other types of surveys as well, but we were commissioned by Project Phoenix through Greening Australia to do a survey of nurseries to determine some characteristics of the native nursery sector. I should say at the outset that this report in full is published looking like that on the Project Phoenix website, so if you want to chase it up, it's easy enough to find there. Different cover, but same stuff. Skip the contents, do the double... I see. Is that the one I want? So we were... Sorry, I'm going to have to change glasses. I might actually get a seat, if I can, so I can... Otherwise I'm going to be switching glasses all the time. Sorry for that. So we were commissioned, as I said, to do the study as part of Project Phoenix. Part of Project Phoenix to answer these 10 questions. Do you grow native plants for restoration from native seed? Do you collect or buy native seed? How many plants do you produce? Could you produce more if there was more demand? Can you access enough seed to meet the demand? Do you routinely test or ask for seed testing data? How do you test the seed if you do? Have any of your staff undertaken native seed management training? Is this nursery owned or managed by a traditional owner group? And in brief, we had 30 of those calls. Apparently that's quite plants for seed or dealt in seed. Interestingly, 100% of the council nurseries did that, 51% of those general nurseries, and not so many of the Indigenous nurseries. 24% overall produced native seed for restoration, of that 220 again. And the second part of the survey obviously focused on the 128 nurseries that actually dealt with native seed. Don't need that. These are just spelling out those summaries in graphs, so I'll move on to the... Oh, this one's interesting. Of the ones that didn't produce native plants for restoration, 70% said they would not consider growing them, so only pretty small percentages, like 19% there of the total said that they would consider moving into native plants. Reasons for doing that were it's not their business model, no space for it, they're only retail, had no skill in propagating native plants. No wonder I say after I've heard the difficulties at these talks. Not enough demand, some said. Yeah, things like that. So it seemed like there wasn't a great wish for expansion from those we spoke to. So this is into the native nursery sector. So a fairly small sample, but a sample of 128. And I think some good indicative material comes out of it that I think emphasises things we've heard before, like from Martin's talk and Paul's talk and David's talk about the difficulties, and the ones this morning about difficulties scaling up the production for the sort of restoration that we all desire. Number of plants produced annually, 41% overall grew between 10 and 25,000 plants, 49% were over the 25,000. Council nursery, if you're interested, 96% either buy or collect native seed. In parentheses, I wonder what the rest do to get their material, but that was the result of the survey. 50% of them both buy and collect, a little bit more in general nurseries, a bit lower in council nurseries. I think they largely just buy their seed in. 34% only collect seed. Yep. Can they get enough seed for their demand? 56% said they could. 34% said they could do with more, which suggests, as we all know, there's a bit of an untapped market. Would they produce more native plants or seed if demand was greater? Similar figure, 71% said that they would produce more plants and or seed if the demand was there, which again is interesting because we know the demand is there, so there's arguably some mismatch between, it might be a regional thing, it might be no demand where they are, or the demand doesn't get to them. You can speculate about why that happens, but possibly indicates a need for a greater integration of the industry. General nurseries, that was 75%, would produce more if they could, if the demand was there. A sad story about seed testing. About half of them don't do any testing or almost never. At the top there on the left, 17% do regular testing. So as we heard in the talk this morning, testing is pretty important for the industry. So this survey indicates a bit of a gap there. Main barriers to expanding their nursery, so back to that issue. A lot said they were limited by space, limited by staff and trained staff, and no funding to underpin it. Yeah, so the usual sort of reasons. The opportunities that they identified were to maintain and improve the environment and biodiversity was important, support the local community, more staff, and obviously the central one of being able to expand if there was more demand. Training of staff in native seed management. Again, not a great result, 60% not trained, 34% had some training, so that could improve. This is the flip side of that, really. 69% would like to access training. 29% said they wouldn't like to access training, and I suspect that correlates with the ones who already have training, so they don't wish to access it. Had they heard of Project Phoenix before? 76% hadn't. This survey was done July last year, I think. So Phoenix had had a bit of time to penetrate the market, so that's perhaps indicative not only of Project Phoenix, which is now over, but perhaps indicative of the need for more information, promotion and penetration by the industry generally. At the end of all our surveys, usually, because people are told they're anonymous unless they agree otherwise, we ask if they were prepared to be contacted further about Project Phoenix, and almost everybody's opted in to be put on mailing lists and that sort of thing, and that was used in part to contact people to see if they were interested in the next stage of Project Phoenix implementation, which has hit a bit of a speed bump, but nevertheless it's a good indication of buy-in and people being interested in promoting the industry. It's just a map of where we interviewed and the people who opted in by nursery type. Spread where you'd expect, I suppose. And the last bit of the study was to try and locate native nurseries on farms. I'm told cattle and mixed farmers, which found the grand sum of only 6 producers who had anything like a native nursery on their farm or a seed production area, and 2. And only 3 who actually qualified for the survey. So there may be more, but it seems like from this sample, again, seed production on farms has a way to go, you might say, from seed production areas. That's just an overview of that. That's that. That's that. That's approximately the end. Thank you.
See there's some interest there in taking up the Project Phoenix. Okay, our final speaker is Ian Davidson. Ian works for Regeneration Solutions Proprietary Limited and is going to talk to us about RAM vegetation condition assessment.
G'day everyone. I'm the speaker that's keeping you from lunch. Listening to some of the talks this morning, a thing called scale was mentioned. I also heard an issue called climate change. But I didn't hear one word said about land managers. The people who own the land, and that includes traditional owners, and if we're serious about getting change, they're the people who need to be engaged in this process. They're the people who will drive demand for seeds or for whatever revegetation services are required. The government has been asleep at the wheel. Research institutions have neglected that area and been happily going along and publishing papers and talking to themselves, doing good research, but at the end of the day, if we're not going to engage landholders, it's just a hobby. It's really, if nature conservation is an important thing and healing country, we've got to think about these things differently. So, what am I doing about it? I've developed a simple assessment model called the Rapid Conservation Assessment Method, and yeah, I'll give you a view about what it's for. It's primarily for land managers or anyone that is actually working on looking at native vegetation in the field. So what is the RAM? It's a simple method of assessing the vegetation condition of a site. It's recorded and scored in the field and allows comparison between other sites and of the same site over time. It enables the recording of the conservation values of many discrete parcels of land, including travelling stock reserves, roadside reserves, paddocks, all sorts. It also enables the collection of other important information that cannot be evaluated remotely. In this day and age of modelling and all fancy algorithms and great satellites and whatever, the reality when I get a model and I go out to look at a parcel of land, I'd be better flipping a coin to get the right answer than looking at that model if it hasn't been ground truth by someone. And part of that reason is there's a bunch of things that you cannot tell remotely. And these things are relevant to land management, quite simple things, including vegetation and habitat features and threats and disturbances. Why have the RAM? It enables land managers to assess the conservation value of small and very large areas and multiple sites in relatively short time frame and collate and compare with other sites. When the RAM's coupled with establishing permanent photo monitoring points, can be used to monitor change in site condition over a period of time. For example, are you getting regeneration? What are the weeds doing? The grazing impacts, are they positive or negative on selected sites? And here's just an example of a recent site that I've done the rapid assessment on, a property called Juanbung Boyong, which is about 42,000 hectares, and took all of 10 days to map. And the owners, including the Nature Conservancy, are now using that to look at what sort of options they've got as far as their management. Where else has the RAM been used and how can it be assessed? To date, the RAM has been applied on thousands of travelling stock reserves. That's where I was able to test different ways of doing things, consult with other field biologists, and basically learn from land managers. And it's also been used on several very large properties, including one at the moment I'm working with traditional owners on a property nearly 90,000 hectares. So when you talk about scale, the whole of Victoria is trying to revegetate an area that's less than that size by 2030 something. It's just got to be part of the answer. We've got to think bigger and streamline all the good things people are doing to be part of this big restoration picture. But it starts with the land managers knowing what the hell they've got and what options they've got on that property. It's envisaged that the RAM app, which is near completion, will be available to all land managers. Anyone that knows me knows that the technology is way past me, but I'm getting it done by someone else. I'm currently working with a software developer and mapping company to produce a free, publicly available RAM app, and hopefully it'll be accessible by the middle of the year. I won't be held to that because what the techno guy tells me I've just got to believe, and there's some issues because the QGIS mapping behind the process. It's relatively new, and there are faults come along that I've got. When it goes onto market for everyone, I don't want people ringing me up and asking me, you know, I press such and I get this. It's just an ironing out process. Who can use it? Following adequate training, all people involved in native vegetation and land management will be capable of undertaking assessments using the RAM. The basic competencies required will be the ability to load and use a mobile phone or smart tablet form. I can do it. I think anyone can do that part of it. And basic vegetation identification skills in the field. For example, the main tree or shrub species and whether the ground layer is mostly native perennial grass or weedy. The actual composition of the ground layer, not necessarily the species, but how much perennial native plants you have in that ground layer is a fundamental thing to understand for the potential for that site to be rehabilitated. Sorry? 2 minutes, great. The basic training is to ensure assessment consistency amongst users, and it's envisaged that once proficient, they can train others. I'm semi-retired, I don't want to be doing it. Intent of RAM. The field assessment component of RAM is not a point-based flora and fauna survey. They do not work for land management because every site is independent. You can't extrapolate it. But rather a method to broadly categorise veg condition in similar areas of native habitat. This helps inform basic management decisions based on the vegetation condition identified at a site. Subsequent flora and fauna surveys of individual areas are recommended if resources permit, and the goal is to determine floristic diversity or presence of absence of particular species. Veg condition uses a standard method to score a range of vegetation elements and characteristics of a site. It's a practical method that was developed to enable, with adequate training, all relevant people to be able to undertake assessments. Broadly similar to what's been undertaken on thousands of sites. The field assessment score provides a vegetation condition rating at a point in time which can be, along with photo points, monitored over time to determine veg condition change. The condition assessment informs a modified vegetation assessment state and transition rating. Thanks, Richard, that way. The modified VAST model is used because it summarises the degree of change that has occurred to native vegetation relative to its estimated undisturbed condition. It is a useful model for land managers because it also incorporates an estimate of the regenerative capacity of modified native vegetation. It's a fundamental thing to understand. I won't bother you with that one, that looks complicated, but basically it just says if it comes out at a certain level, for example, regeneration potential. Some sites just have no regeneration potential. Others you shouldn't be putting plants into because they're at such a level that they're self-replicating. And here's part of the deal. Here's the 5 measures that are used. Veg structure, large trees, this is for woodland. Woody vine presence. The weediness, you'll notice the high scientific terms I'm using. And the nativeness, the actual diversity in the ground layer. And then there's a score, and I'm finished, I think, and they're the additional things you measure. Anyway, that's the end. Thank you.
Deal with the fact that different communities have different levels of weediness, and for instance, grassy woodlands, grasslands have got a lot of weeds, but all examples will have weeds. And they still have native plants, but the native plants sometimes are only evident certain times of the year. If you go the wrong time of the year, it'll be totally weedy understory. So I'm just wondering how you cope with that.
Excellent question. Is that on, I guess? Excellent question. If you're doing a broad scale to find out is there resilience, you're best doing it in autumn, in temperate zones. Because basically you don't want that flush of annual weeds that come about. But if you're doing it at spring because you want to get diversity, you can do the same thing. It's been used in coastal areas, and at the moment it's being used out now in saltbush country, which basically doesn't have a lot of grass. It's mainly annual saltbushes. True, but so much time's been wasted, quite frankly, on dividing up veg communities and types rather than understanding fundamentally is it functional? Has it got that ability to regenerate? And so the idea that there's more grass means that it's better is a fallacy. Has it got more perennial grass, for example? More native perennial grass, and that's the thing that you need to be able to actually be able to assess to make that determination.
That sounds like a good discussion for lunchtime. Can we have our next question?
This one's for you, Nick, coming from our online audience. Any suggestions on how to convince an LGA to see gardens for wildlife as worthwhile in urban areas, rather than just concentrating on the green wedge when it comes to caring for biodiversity?
Thanks for the question. I guess with Gardens for Wildlife programs, I'd argue they need to be much more specific than they are. I've had a PhD student look at Gardens for Wildlife in Eastern LGA in Melbourne, and they weren't necessarily very different to traditional gardens because they weren't specifying, they weren't targeting general wildlife rather than targeting a specific taxa. And so I think the guidance needs to be a lot more specific around that. But I'd also be looking at how do those Gardens for Wildlife programs complement the council objectives. So whether it's connectivity, making sure that the target gardens are in proximity to connectivity corridors and those sort of things around that argument. But I generally use an ecosystem services argument when making those points around pollination, pest control, etc.
Okay.
Which they're receptive to.
A question for Lee about Norfolk Island plants over here. Thank you for your talk. I had a question about some of those missing interactions you mentioned. You talked about seed dispersing pigeons no longer being there. Norfolk Island also used to have millions of seabirds nesting on those islands that aren't anymore. So I'm wondering, with your rare plants that are getting rarer, have you tried fertilising them by adding guano? Because there would have been thousands of tonnes of marine-derived crap deposited every year. That's not happening anymore. Have you mucked around with that at all?
It's a great point. Yeah, there's definitely been that huge loss of nutrients flow from the ocean to the land. So I haven't tried actively fertilizing, and I don't think it's been trialed that I know of. But it seems like the rare plants grow fine once they've established a bit. So if you can grow them up to a good enough height that they won't get ripped out or chewed up or anything like that, and you plant them out, they do okay. It's more, they just don't get there. But I'm sure that fertilization would definitely improve the plant assemblages on the island. It's a great point.
Thanks, Leah. All right, that's all the time we have for questions. If you have more questions for the speakers, please catch them up at lunchtime. And I'll give you your lovely bottles of wine, and then everybody can go to lunch. Can you join us in thanking our speakers?